It's Monday no, it's not Monday. It's not Monday at all. It's Sunday. Sunday, 28th of August. We're in the middle of a long bank holiday weekend, and I'm wishing it away like an idiot. So we've finished Canada, and we're going to do a very, very long run of grain whiskies now. We've got a massive 2 of them to get through. I've had a couple of ones earlier on in the challenge, but I have 2, so I'm going to do them now, and then we will look at doing blended whiskies, of which there is a bit of a chunk of that. So grain leads nicely into blended whiskies, because grain is quite a large component of that. Essentially, very basically, grain whiskies are used to bulk out a blended whiskey, and then malt whiskies tend to be used as the flavour and kind of give you the depth and complexity that you'd be looking for from a blended whiskey. So grain whiskey is quite a key part to particularly Scotch whiskey production. Without grain whiskey, there wouldn't be blended whiskey, and there wouldn't be the wide range of whiskies. And blended whiskies is kind of what brought Scotch single malt to where it is now. If it wasn't for blended whiskey, Scotch single malt possibly wouldn't be as big and popular. It would exist, I think, but it certainly wouldn't be on the scale of what it is now, because with blends, because grain whiskey is a different type of production to single malt whiskey, and therefore you can get a lot more out of it. It's lower cost of production. Yes, it doesn't generically taste as good, and it doesn't have as much depth and richness, but you can make a lot of it, and then you can use that as your base. So grain whiskey is well used as a different type of still. Pot still whiskey, which is what you tend to use with single malts, is the classical still that you would tend to see pictures of in museums, tourist attractions, things like that, about, whiskey. If you have an icon of Scotch whiskey, single malt whiskey, it would be the pot still. So it's a big bulbous base, kind of sometimes get a little bubble bit, and then a long tapering neck that tapers off to the side, and called a swan neck. To do that, you have to put your mash in, you have to heat it, boil it, get the vapours running off to get your alcohol, then you've got to empty it out, and then you have to start again. With grain whiskey, what's known as a column still is more of a continual process, and you can keep operating it all the time. You don't have to kind of clear it out, so you can make a lot more of it, and you can keep running it all the time, like a factory, essentially. So grain whiskey tends to get a bit of a rough reputation, and there's not that much of it around on its own. It's quite hard to find a single grain whiskey, simply because it is a vital component of making blends, and blends is a far bigger industry. So single malt, now there is a demand for single malt whiskies, and therefore whiskey distillers and producers are sort of having to do a bit of a juggling act in terms of, right, we need to have the single malt for the people that want it, and there is a demand for it, and people will pay more for a single malt than they would for a blend. But we still have a big market of blends, and we still have to ship to Europe and America, so we still need the core content of the blend, so we still need to make the grain, we still need the malt whiskies to make that. So it's you tend to find single malts because there's more demand for them, whereas with a single grain, people haven't yet cottoned on to single grains, and it still gets a bit of a bad reputation. And to be honest, I found with single grains, or grain whiskey generally, it tends to need more aging. You have to sit on it for longer in cask before it starts getting any complexity or interest or anything like that. Rough rule of thumb, there are some absolute crackers out there. Cameron Brigg, for example, the Cameron Brigg blend, the grain that they do, which is 20 quid, 15 to 20 quid, unless you're buying it from the whiskey shop, in which case it's about 30, is actually pretty decent. It's quite young, but it's good for the price, and it's very, very interesting. A Club, on the other hand, which is also made at Cameron Bridge, is overpriced and crap. But fair play to them for trying to do a single grain, because I think what they've looked at is, if we do a single grain at a young age, it's sort of lighter and it doesn't have a great deal of flavour to it. And the one thing that Hay Club does not have is a great deal of flavour, but it's not a good introduction to whiskey, but they're thinking of it as, this would be an introduction to whiskey. It gives you a hint of what whiskey would be like, and if you like that, then you can start moving into the whiskey market. Anyway, There is another company out there that are trying to do things a little differently, and they are called Compass Box. And this sample was donated to me by James Booth. Thank you very much, James. And this isn't, I've got really itchy nose. Hay fever's kicking in. This isn't a single grain. This is actually a blended grain whiskey. So we've touched on blended malts already. And have I got more of them to go, or have I done that? No, I'm sure I've got some blended malts still left to go. So blended whiskies are a blend of grain whiskey and single malt whiskey, however many single malt whiskies there may be. A single malt whiskey is malt whiskey that is produced from one distillery. So you could have a blended whiskey, which is a combination of grain whiskey and single malts, either from one distillery or multiple distilleries, and that is a blended whiskey. Used to be known as vatted malts, but now the Scotch Whisky Association said no, they've got to be called blended malts, is when you have single malts from more than one distillery blended together, but not the grain. So blended whiskey, grain and single malts all together. Blended malt is single malts, just single malts from various distilleries blended together. Single malt, one malt whiskey from one distillery. Single grain, one grain whiskey from one distillery. Blended grain whiskies from a number of distilleries blended together, but no malt whiskey thrown in there. It's a bit of hard work really, but hopefully if you weren't aware, that should clarify things a little bit. So this is a combination of grain whiskies from a number of different distilleries around Scotland. Now there are six or seven grain distilleries that are pretty much factories, and they are churning this stuff out because there is so much demand for them. So there aren't many of them, which you think would be a surprise considering how many blended whiskies there are and how much demand there is around the world. But these are bloody factories. They are churning it out. They don't need more than six because these guys are operating almost 24/7 and they're doing millions of litres of the stuff on a daily basis. Well, not quite on a daily basis, but you know what I mean. So Compass Box was a company set up by a guy called John Glazer in 2000, and John Glazer used to be a marketing director for Johnnie Walker, which you've probably heard of. I hope you would have heard of it. And Johnnie Walker is a brand that's owned by Diageo, and the impression I get was it was a bit of a light bulb moment. If you've seen Jerry Maguire, that Tom Cruise film, now Tom Cruise, I can take or leave Tom Cruise, but Jerry Maguire, great film, and the start of it is he's working for this sports agency and he has this epiphany where it's like, no, we should be doing things differently, and he writes a mission statement for the company and they kick him out. And it was not quite like that with John Glazer, but it really was a case of actually what are we doing here? Why are we selling whiskey this way? Why are we doing this? So he left Diageo and set up on his own, essentially doing stuff from his kitchen, where he was buying stock and was trying to do things differently and going, do you know what? Single malt is not everything. It doesn't have to be single malt is better. It doesn't have to be, it's the older it is, the better it is. The more expensive it is, the better it is. Let's look at the constituent parts of whiskey and make it more accessible. Let's make it more interesting. Let's try and explain what it is that we are doing as a company, where we're getting these whiskies from, what cask we're using, why we're doing it, and try and make better drinking whiskey and prove that a single malt is not necessarily the best whiskey. Combinations of single malts can be. Combinations of grain and single malt or grains can be better, if not necessarily better, easily as good as single malts and single grains. So they have a range of whiskies, and I do have a couple of other Compass Boxes to come up in the challenge. I've already had a conversation with some people on Facebook because I had quite a few of them. I had about 6 Compass Boxes because they do a blended malt and they do a blend and they do the grain and they do the blended malts that they do are different versions as well. They're actually quite good expressions of various styles of whiskey, and I had all of them in there. And then it was only when my wife turned around and said, well, aren't you supposed to be doing different distilleries and brands? I was like, oh crap, actually, yeah, that's a good point. So I've scaled them back. Now I've kept 2, one kind of inadvertently, so I'm going to see if I can replace it with another one. They have a blended whiskey, which is still in the list at the moment. I am thinking quite seriously about taking that one out. But there is another one that Compass Box have done, which is a blended malt, one of their blended malts, which has quite an interesting backstory to it as well. And and I think is worth putting in the challenge really for what it's about and what it stands for. And then I've kept this in the challenge because otherwise I'd have one grain to go for, and that would be it. So I'm hoping that you people out there will let me get away with 2. I think I'm going to take the blend out as well. So, Hedonism, they've called it. This is what the bottle looks like. You're looking at, well, Master and Malt selling this for 55 quid, and the Whisky Exchange is selling it for 60, which seems pretty steep, but grain whisky is pretty hard to get hold of. And with Compass Box, no age statement on any of them. No chill filtration, and no colouring is added, so it's as clean and as pure as they can, as untouched, as clean, pure, as untouched as they can make it. Because the argument is chill filtration makes it purer, so it's as untouched as they can possibly make it. So there is a good chance. Now they don't say where these distilleries are from. They're very good at giving you like a product sheet that you can find on the net. And they do say that they make this once or twice a year in batches, and depending on what they can get for each batch, it is from a number of different distilleries, but they can't say, right, this particular one is from those distilleries. So there's Carsbridge, Cambus, Cameron Bridge, Dumbarton and Port Dundas. The only other one that I can think of that's a grain distillery that's not on that list is actually the next one that we're going to have. So if all 5 of them are in there, that would be quite handy, because after the next one, I've got my grain distilleries covered anyway. But I don't think that's the case. So it's 43%. So they don't necessarily, they don't go down to cask strength, but they tend not to do at 40%. It's matured in, now what I don't know is whether the whole thing's matured in, or whether they're taking the stock from the various places, and when they're blending them together, it goes into 100% first fill American oak. Which is essentially bourbon casks. My guess would be possibly, because it's pretty pale in colour, to be perfectly honest. They're also very, very big on transparency, and they're having a bit of a battle at the moment. And if you can, and if you've not done so already, if you can go to Compass Box's website and click on a button where it says join us for transparency, they're having a running battle with the Scotch Whisky Association and also the EU, with the fact that regulations state that you cannot, in Scotch whisky, blended whiskies, blended malts, all of this lot, say exactly what proportion of whisky is from what distillery is in your blend. So you can't say this is 60% from Ardbeg and 20% from Glenmorangie and 20% from Auchentoshan. And that is what we've used, and that's what's in your bottle. You can't do that. Although, as a consumer, surely that's actually for your benefit. Surely it's better for you to know what goes into it. God knows there's been enough stuff going on in the world. Last year, horse meat scandal with IKEA meatballs. Everybody found out what was in it, whereas with transparency, it would be impossible to do something about that, because you'd have to say what it is. What Compass Box is saying is, we don't want to force everybody to state what is in it, because a lot of business within the Scotch Scotch whisky industry, in terms of buying stock for blends and blended malts and doing own labels and supermarket whiskies and things like that. Supermarkets don't make their own whiskey. They are buying stock from other producers and bottling it under their own labels, or getting somebody else to put their own labels on it and just putting it on the shelf and selling it. They are coming from other distilleries. So Sainsbury's single malt, Marks and Spencer's own single malt, they're not making it. They don't have their own distillery. It is bought from somewhere else. Sometimes there are clues, but generally the deal is there'll be a distillery somewhere, and I'm just going to say Lagavulin on Islay. Don't know whether they do, got a feeling they do, but I'm not sure if they do. That Lagavulin, Marks and Spencer's go to Lagavulin and say, we'd like to do an Islay single malt under our own label. Will you sell us some of your stock at a good price that we can sell it? And we're Marks and Spencer's. We're going to sell bucket loads of this stuff, so we can give you a smaller margin, but we're going to buy a lot more stock off you and guarantee that you're going to be selling stock for the next 20 years. So Lagavulin are going, actually that sounds quite good. We've got guaranteed sales for 20 years. We're going to make a decent amount of profit over it. Yes, okay, but we don't want people to know that we as Lagavulin are selling whiskey to Marks and Spencer's. And strictly speaking, as a consumer, you can go to Marks and Spencer's and get a 12-year-old Lagavulin for quite considerably cheaper than you would do if you were buying it from Lagavulin themselves. That's the way the business runs. That's absolutely fine. And what Compass Box are saying is, we don't want to force everybody in the industry to do that. What they're saying is, we should have the option to be able to say, as an independent bottler, this is where we've got our whiskies from. Now, it might be that where they're buying it from don't want it to say, so they won't do that. What they'll do is to say, right, 60% of this is from Ardbeg, 20% of this is from somewhere that we can't say, but it's in this region, not even specific to, it's kind of over there, it's a Highland whiskey. There's a lot of Highland distilleries, who knows where it is, and the other 20% is Auchentoshan, something like that. Or if all of them say, yes, we're happy for you to say what's in it, then Compass Box can say, it's this, 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 and as a consumer you're going, well, that sounds interesting, I like Ardbeg, I'm not so keen on Glenmorangie, and Auchentoshan I can take it or leave it, let's see what it's like. Actually, that's really good. Wow, they've done a really good job. Because to be honest, as a whiskey drinker, I am fascinated to see what people can do when they are blending different whiskies. And I think it's personally as skilled a job as making a single malt, because you're taking 2, 3, 4 different component parts. I'm amazed at master blenders. The fact that they can go through casks and go, right, we need that one and that one and that one, and it will maintain the consistency of all the other releases that they've done down the line for the last 30 years. It's incredible stuff. So to know what people are doing, to get them to say, we took Ardbeg, Glenmorangie and Auchentoshan and we made this whiskey that tastes unlike any of them individually but is as good. Great stuff. As a consumer, that's what you want, but the industry and the EU don't want you to know that. They don't want you to know, because it's bad for business. They think it's bad for business. They think, oh, yes, no. And also, for some businesses, they don't want it to know, because they don't want people to know what they're getting away with. That's why there's this heat against no-age statements. A lot of whiskey drinkers don't like no-age statements because they feel like they're being hoodwinked a little bit. They feel like if you put a no-age statement on it and you put the price up, so you've got, I don't know, Highland Park 12-year-old is 40 quid. You've got then all of a sudden this Highland Park comes out that doesn't have an age statement on it but comes in a fancy box and looks very good, and all of a sudden is 100 quid, and it's like, well, what age is in it? Oh, well, it's a combination of ages. All right, what's the combination? Oh, well, there's some really old whiskey in there as well. There's like 40-year-old Highland Park in it. Okay, fair enough, but what else is in it? Because you could have a miniature's worth of 40-year-old Highland Park, and the rest could be 8-year-old, and you're charging over twice the price because you put it in a fancy box. Unless you've got some kind of transparency where you can say, right, what we've done is we've taken Highland Park and we've got 10% 40-year-old Highland Park, because let's face it, it's 40-year-old Highland Park, we haven't got that much of it, and it's expensive stuff, and if we were going to sell it on its own, it would be $2,000. So we've got some of that, we've got some 18-year-old, we've got a little bit of 21-year-old, and we've got 25% 8-year-old, because that actually kind of lifts everything up and balances out really well. It's 100 quid, but these are all the whiskies that are in it, and this is the work that we've done. Fair enough, not a problem at all. But, that apparently that's, get off my glass, you little git. Apparently that's not what we want as consumers, and that's too dangerous. Get off. Going to be flamethrower in a minute. So yeah, that completely digresses me from actually tasting this whiskey. So, hedonism, combination of different grains, unusual to find grain whiskies, very, very difficult. Grain whiskies tend to be slightly more expensive as well, which sort of doesn't help the market, but that is a lovely sweet nose. It's got a hint of it's like a light white dessert wine. It's not cloyingly sweet, it's not claggy or really sugary. It's very vanilla-y, and it's like a really, really nice dessert wine that's just slightly fragrant. Very gentle, very soft on the nose. It's almost like vanilla custard. In fact, you know what it reminds me of on the nose? It reminds me of a vanilla slice. So, thin pastry. I can't remember what pastry it is. It's not sheet pastry on a vanilla slice. What sort of pastry is it? Because it's slightly flaky, but it's still quite hard. So pastry, thick layer of custard, pastry, icing on top. It's got all of that in there because it's got the freshness of the icing and the sweetness of the vanilla. Or is it creme pat? I don't know. The Great British Bake Off's on, so all of a sudden it's like creme pat this and creme pat that. Who is this creme pat? What's her problem? Very, very delicate nose. Oh, that's good. That custardiness comes through. There's a lovely effervescence on the tongue. It's slightly sparkling. It really is. It feels like it's lightly sparkling. And then there's this, all around the side of your mouth, there's this sweet, creamy vanilla custard. There's a lovely heat at the back, but it's so gentle, it's so soft. That is gorgeous. That is so good. And unusually, quite a lot of grain whiskies that I've had have had an edge to it, like a metallic edge to it. This has got none of that at all. It's almost slightly lemony at the start, but it's not a sour lemon, it's not lemon sherbet. It's a really gentle, light lemon. It's like lemon's been added into a dessert, so you get like a lemon mousse almost, where it's a really gentle lemon mousse, not a sharp zingy one. That's a gorgeous whiskey. That's ridiculously good. You wouldn't need dessert after a meal, you just have that. That is absolutely wonderful stuff. It's got a lovely mouthfeel, which really accentuates that custardy feel to it. And it's like a proper vanilla custard, where you can tell that they've used vanilla pods to make it. That is wonderful. Really, really good. 55, 60 quid. It's actually worth it. It really is. I think that's stunning. That is so good. And quite unlike anything else that I've had so far. Excellent stuff. I'm still going to have to take the blend out of the challenge, but the people that have donated it, I might have to ask them if I can keep the other ones, because that's an absolute corker. And if the others are akin to quality of that level, they're going to be absolutely stonking stuff. Right, I'm going to have a quick rinse out and then crack on with another one, because I've been quite a long time on this video. I do apologise. Right, I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.